understanding how and why things happen will help you find your groove and develop practice and systems that will lead to a successful poultry operation. Coming up, we're going to help begin this journey to real accomplishment.
The laying cycle is pretty much square one of the beginning of what you can grow your flock from. It's probably one of the most important things when it comes to poultry because you're not going to get very far if those girls aren't laying good. So we're going to talk a little bit about how they lay, the variations of laying between the varieties, and how to select for those laying traits, especially with how lighting can affect the cycle and the regional variances you might encounter with your different climates and how that could also affect the laying cycle. You want to have reasonable goals when breeding for the production improvement with the laying. And you also want to have good record keeping. That can be very important as well. And John has some thoughts on how he keeps his records, and I want to know how he does it.
Ideally, my record keeping starts the minute the egg is collected. Literally, I write the time down on the egg, as well as the hen, and if known, the rooster, and that gets set in the collection tray. And then I just stack my eggs by date. And when it comes time to set the best eggs, they invariably come from very specific hens. The sorting process is pretty easy. When you look at a tray and go, that's a winner, that's a winner, that's a winner, that's a winner, and they're all from the same hen, it makes it easy. Now, when you start getting 200 layers in a laying flock, we had the luxury of only selecting eggs that were laid before 9 a.m. under the premise that we were selecting for better production by that initial toll gate in the collection process.
See, and I give my girls up until like 2 o'clock to lay. And if they lay later than that, they take the next day off. So I'm always out there looking at who's laying when and figuring out the feel for that particular hen's schedule. And then once you see the hen lay her egg and you can identify what she lays, because there is a lot of consistency from egg to egg. If they're not having any problems, then they may lay the perfect egg every single day. Some of them will have their own variations, and then off that egg variation, you can figure out who was laying it and how often they lay.
The luxury of having 5 laying hens and 2 roosters right now set up in a couple of mating clans, it's really easy to identify which hen laid which egg. When you start getting into dozens, it gets a little more difficult for me, at least.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, Rick, you had some notes here.
Crazy hen that goes over the fence to lay somewhere in the yard every day that I need to track.
Those are always a challenge to keep up with, aren't they?
They are. And when I find those eggs, those are the first ones I crack and mix them with their feed and feed back to the flock because they have the highest immunoglobulin properties to build flock immunity.
Oh, that's true. I've read about that, but I've never practiced it.
Yeah, find that rogue hen and collect her eggs and crack them open, feed them back in the feed. That's how, scientists in laboratories make vaccines. So why can't the farmer inoculate against the pathogens the same way?
Getting back to the record keeping thing, most of my breeding was done by family. So I would have multiple females and one male in each breeding pen. All the females were related. They were either moms, daughters, sisters, aunts, grandparents, but all the females were related in that one family. So I just simply wrote the pen number on the egg and the date that it was laid, and then went from there. Later on, as I began to become more aware of the need for improving production in my bird, and so I was tuned in to, I need to know exactly which hen laid which egg and which rooster she was mated with. And I switched over to small individual pens. The other option is to pat nesting, but I was leaving the house before daylight and getting home after dark. So it wasn't possible for me to check pat nest on a periodic basis. You need to check those every hour and a half at least throughout the day, because once that hen is in that nest, the trap nest, she can't get out. So you know which hen laid which egg, and you can get a pretty good handle on what time of day that egg was laid.
I should be doing that with how much time available I have and get down to pair hatching out of my little clan groups. I don't have large groups. I've only averaged about 6 hens per male per pen, but I could be a lot more organized with trap nests since I am here to go and check them.
Well, a little bit different than what you're talking about. I didn't do pair matings. I would have 3 or 4 females all mated to one male, and then I would just rotate the male from pen to pen to pen every day, day and a half, 2 days, something like that.
I did that earlier this season because I had a male that was a big fan of the idea, to where when I opened up his pen door, he'd walk right out. We'd walk down to the other pen together. I'd open the door, he'd hop in, do his thing, and I could put him back in the other pen an hour later. He had what I call vigor.
Yes, indeed. Well, speaking of vigor, I think that's one thing that kind of gets overlooked in breeding. They forget the importance of vigor in birds. And when you lose vigor, you lose so much. I mean, you lose feed conversion, you lose meat production, you lose egg production.
Poor vigor affects everything. You can almost lose your entire flock if you've lost the vigor in it.
Absolutely. But then I kind of digress there. But we were talking about breeding for production qualities, or leading up to talking about that. But the first thing that I look for when I'm doing that sort of a breeding program, like I said, is vigor. And then I look for the proper conformation. I want to be sure that the females and the males too have the body structure, skeletal structure, and the body structure they need to be good, productive birds. If they don't have the right body capacity, you're pretty much just spinning your wheel. So proper bodies, and then I would fine tune it for egg production. I looked at things like the rate of feathering. The faster a bird feathers, usually the faster they mature and start laying eggs.
That's one of the earliest indicators too.
Yeah,
A vigorous bird is, selecting their feathering rate. Who comes in the fastest?
I looked at the day the hen laid her first egg, because I tracked those females in those special breeding pens for a year. I tracked their production for a year, so I knew how many eggs they laid in a year. But I wanted to track their length of persistency. And by that, I mean, how many eggs did that hen lay for how long? So,
Before she took a pause.
Right. Yeah. And the pause is the other thing that I looked at.
Well, I think that's a good topic, is the schedule that hens lay eggs on.
If you have a hen that's lay 5 or 6 eggs and then pauses for one day and then starts laying again, that old gal's a keeper. But
that's what I look for. I look for those 5 to 6 eggs a week. They take a day off, they get right back to it. So that persistency then is week by week and month into month. And how many months are they going to carry that on with? Because I've had girls before where they were persistent layers for a good 6 months, and then they took a 5-month break. And that's not going to work for keeping your egg supply up. You want the most persistent girls. And sometimes you might get better longevity if they're doing 4 eggs a week, but they'll keep at it for a longer period of time. But the amount of variation I've seen in laying, that was eye-opening. Once I started building the flock into quantity and I started to see the real range that was in there, then it let me know how I needed to select for that persistency and watch them when they take a break and how long that break is for. Because if she's going to take all the space and the resources, but then sit there and not be productive for more than, like, what do you guys think is a good length of break? Like when they go through a molt or when they take a pause, or like maybe they don't lay that great in the winter. How much time do you give them for a break?
Are you talking about a pause, or are you talking about the break for molting?
a break?
Just the weekly break. I think that ties back into me selecting eggs that are laid earlier in the morning, because the chicken doesn't lay on a 24-hour cycle. She lays on a 25 or 26-hour cycle.
Yeah,
And
so
then
they'll
she'll get
take
to a
that
point
day off.
later and later in the day where she no longer feels safe and comfortable laying her egg, and she'll hold it until the next sunrise and then start laying really early in the morning again, hopefully. And that's why selecting earlier in the morning, I believe you're selecting for a more productive hen.
And talking about Mandy's break, I knew what my goals were to increase production. I knew where my birds were at, where I started from. And I was only getting about 130 to 150 eggs per.
Did they do it all at once, or did they do it for a while and then take a long break? What did that look like for that 150 eggs?
I wasn't tracking that at that point. I just knew what the average flock production was. But ideally, the more eggs you get in a row, followed by just a 1-day break, those are the kind of birds you want to look at for starting a foundation program for egg production. Okay. If you've got a hen that lays 3 eggs and takes a break for 2 days or 3 days, that's an automatic. You had your chance, you're out.
Yeah.
At least for me.
Agreed.
The longer the persistency is and the shorter the pause is what you're looking for. You may not have that at first. So you have to sort of establish some baseline data going into this thing once you start this kind of program. You got to know where you started, and you got to know where you want to go. And by where you want to go, I want to encourage folks to be reasonable in their expectations. If you've got a dual purpose bird and you're trying to get it up to what today's modern hybrids lay, 300 plus eggs a year, you're not going to make it. That's the bottom line. I think a reasonable goal is 200 to maybe 230, 40 eggs a year for a dual purpose bird.
I haven't done the math yet, but I've got a bird who I think is my rock star, who will lay between 4 and 5 eggs and then take a day pause and start up again, 37, 32. And she just is consistent like that all the way through. Other birds will take longer pauses, and they usually lay later in the day.
Now, when they mention the eggs per year for a certain breed, when you look up a breed and it says they'll lay 250 or 150, when they're saying that, how many years of that bird's life are they going to do that? Because that can vary tremendously as well. And I think most of that's based off of first year performance.
I just started to say most of those numbers are based off of their pullet year, their first year of laying production.
And after that, it'll dwindle down, and it's a matter of how much it dwindles. Because sometimes your best offspring come from the 2-year-old hens rather than the 1-year-old hens.
Oh, I agree.
And
they're much stronger, more vigorous chicks.
yeah,
And the egg size is
proven.
bigger. But knowing what a pullet lays in her first year is important, because then you know to expect about 85% in her second year of lay. You know, she's laying 200 eggs a year. You can expect 85% of that in her second year of lay. And then the next year it drops a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. But another thing to look at is how long are your hens productive for?
Yeah, because some of those production breeds, especially in the hybrids, they'll have a steep.
Some of them you can't even get to go to 2 years for a decent production rate.
Commercially, don't they cycle them out at like 18 months old?
When we had our commercial Leghorn flock, we'd bring in a flock of pullets, and in 12 months, we'd bring in another group of pullets and just replace the original flock.
I know I usually grow my favorites up to their first year. Then after that, every 6 months, I'm thinning them out some more. So if I have roughly 30 birds at 1 year old, by the time they're 2, I've got 15 of them left, because those are the ones that still have good performance going on.
Well,
then
you
I hatch
support and
everything
select
they
your breeding
lay.
qualities. You have that luxury to sort and hatch out and see what they throw, and then really focus in on your selection.
Next season's going to be a good season because I've got a pretty healthy batch that'll be coming 2 years old. Then that incubator's going to be busy.
You're going to need a bigger incubator. That's about.
I'm going to need another
Yeah,
barn.
third.
Another thing I want to tell folks to be mindful of when they're trying to improve production is their molting rate. In other words, how fast do they molt and get back to laying?
Sure.
And I know by the looks on your faces, you're going to ask me, how long is that? Well, it's going to vary from breed to breed, and it's going to vary with the quality of the stock that you started with. So there's not a hard and fast rule. But if you've got a female that, man, in just 2 or 3 days, she's dropping tons of feathers, she grows them back, she's ready to go back and start laying again. That's the kind of female you want. You don't want birds start dropping a few feathers here and a few feathers there. And they may molt all of their wing feathers at one time. They may not, and they may drop all of their tail feathers. That bird goes down the road. They're not going to do you any good because they're dragging that out. And the longer that molting process goes, the fewer eggs a hen's going to lay.
Well, we've already, talked about managing our molt in the previous episode, so we should be there and watching our birds very carefully and managing them through the molt, and again, making a decision as to who's going to carry on and be our breeding stock and who's going to head to noodle camp.
Another thing to look at is your total cost to produce a dozen eggs. Now, I'm not talking just feed cost. You got to factor in labor and all of those other associated costs to really know what that dozen eggs cost you, and it's going to surprise you.
Ouch.
Guaranteed. I knew I about flipped out when I saw it.
I try to avoid that kind of math.
There was a page of it in Jeff's book, and I looked at it and I went, yeah, let's just tear that out. Nobody needs to see that.
Yeah, some of those things make my eyes cross, I will admit.
I mean, what I should be charging for a dozen eggs at farmer's market, what it costs me to produce a dozen eggs, I couldn't sell.
Well, and especially if some of those eggs are coming from some prime breeding examples too. I've had some very, very expensive omelets.
Yeah.
Yes.
That probably should have been chickens.
And
we get hungry, so I'm not above eating prime hatching eggs if I have to.
Oh, been there, done that.
I'm not going to go buy eggs at the store, that's for sure.
They can taste a little fishy, though, if you're on a breeder supplemented diet. I'm just saying.
Only if it exceeds 10% for that fish
I
meal.
can detect it at lower levels, honestly.
Can you?
He's sensitive.
Yes, I am sensitive.
That's true.
And I'm not a super taster. I was tested.
Another thing I think we need to track when we're working on production quality. Really, you need to track it whether you're working on production qualities or not. And that's the rate of fertility and the rate of hatchability. Getting a hen to lay an egg, that's spectacular. Getting a hen to lay a fertile egg is even better. That's sort of the icing on the cake. I've had hens that laid eggs, stellar hens that I really wanted chicks from. Never got a fertile egg from those gals the whole time I had them.
I've encountered that before, and sometimes it was the boy, sometimes it was the female and how she didn't want to be around the boy I picked for her.
Yes.
And other times they'd be fertile. They just would not do a gosh dang thing. I had an entire flock of really rare birds, and I had a male and 5 females, and I set every single egg those birds laid, and I got one scrawny, pathetic cockerel out of it. And I tried probably 1.5 years or 2 years. I changed the diet. I changed everything, and nothing hatched. So
it can be so frustrating when that happens. And that's another thing that we need to be tracking on our birds. Not only what the percentage of fertility is, but what's the percentage of strong, healthy chicks hatched.
Yes. Very important stuff. I've called out birds based on their hatch results.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find the best meat producing flocks produce the best chicks?
Yes.
They should.
Okay. Just checking. Because we haven't gotten into that yet.
I don't know where, when, or how it
conversion
happened, but there's some sort of when folks say that they have a egg bred flock, and then you get in there and you start handling the hens, and they are very lean,
Mhm.
lean. And
Mhm.
that makes, typically a productive layer. But some of my best layers are also very stacked in the fleshing department. And I have to be careful on obesity and make sure that it's meat, not fat, because fat hens don't lay that well. But I've had really meaty birds that laid every bit as well as a leaner, lighter weight bird.
Did
I had a set of silver lace Brahmas that were
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
project variety from a pretty well-known breeder, and it took every bit of 9 months before they started laying, and when they
Yep.
did, the eggs were very small, and they only came 3 days a week,
Yep.
and it
That's
stayed that
typical.
way.
Yep.
The eggs never got bigger. They were fantastic broodies, though. I'll give them that.
Which, talking about bigger eggs, that's another thing you should be tracking. What is the egg size? What is the average egg size of that female? If it's mediums or smalls, she's not doing you any good. You want large, mostly large, and then extra large.
Yeah.
I know some folks are selecting for the big jumbos and they love the double yolkers. I know one breeder who ran into a problem with the flock of Delawares because he was selecting based on egg size.
And they were a bunch of double yolks.
Yep. He finally got them to where they were laying a bunch of double yolk eggs, and his hatchability hit rock bottom.
Yeah,
So,
you gotta watch
it's a
that.
case that too much of a good thing is bad for you.
Usually my girls have a couple of weeks where they change their egg size from the small pullet eggs, and then they balloon up into a double yolk, and then they level off after that
Hmm.
into a nice solid 60 gram, 65 gram. But I'm not
That's usually
surprised
about
when I
week
see
30.
new layers popping out 96 grams, 100 grams for double yolks. And they go in the breakfast basket until
Yep.
they figure out their
Absolutely.
system. That's
We've
what
been, go ahead.
It's one thing I won't do for science is to try to hatch double yolks. It's not a novelty to me to even mess around with that.
It's a waste of effort and resources to
Yeah.
do that. I know some folks have hatched them, but
The odds
those,
aren't great.
no, I just started saying those hatches come few and far between.
There was somebody that hatched one by accident. She counted 11 eggs and there was 12 chicks, and they were about, half size when she weighed them. Yeah, it happened. And I wonder how they're doing now, because it's very rare to actually get twins to hatch and to live.
Yes. Let's talk. We've been talking about egg production. Let's talk about what those folks that want to focus on meat production should be looking at in their breeders. I think you want to track your breeders so you can identify how many days it took them to go from hatch to market weight.
That varies a lot by individual
It does.
sometimes.
It does. Then track what their average daily gain was. That's good to know.
Well, even weekly would be good to have.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Just a weekly flock weight, if nothing else.
We can get caught up into this rapid growth rate. And for meat production, in a way, that's good. But for the long-term success of the flock, you may not want that extreme rate of maturity.
Well, there's some breeds the skeletons can't handle it.
Well, the bottom line is the longer that goes, the shorter the period to maturity, those birds tend to burn out, and that the longevity is just not there.
And we have birds dying of heart attacks at 12 weeks old.
I like to look for more moderate, but still productive period to get those birds to market weight.
And the dual purpose thing, I've noticed that your fast maturing birds, when they really hit the ground running, and both males and females are finished early, to where those boys can go to the table at 14 weeks and the girls turn around and start laying at 16 weeks. They do burn out. There is such a thing as taking it too far. And I put myself there when I was chasing growth rate, and I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
I got to back this up a little bit.
Well, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody, but when I overemphasize one trait, I lose focus on the entire bird. And anytime we're breeding, we got to keep the big picture of where we are and where we're trying to go in mind. Because once you start focusing on just a single thing, it usually comes back to bite you, you know? Another thing that I like to look at is what's the feed conversion rate? How much feed does it take to put a pound of weight on that bird? Your better birds grow and gain weight well on a lesser amount of feed. Check the bird's fleshing rate. And Mandy, I know you're really good about this, but you got to handle your birds. You got to feel the bodies. You got to actually feel how much flesh is on that skeleton. And
yeah, I found out that when you weigh them, if you're not also feeling them, you might be weighing more bone than fleshing. You might be weighing more fleshing than bone. And I've had to slow myself down quite a bit in what I select for and when, without calling through too soon for too much, because I've put myself into corners before by doing that.
yeah,
But I do monitor growth and fleshing over the first 12 weeks and the body capacity. I like those bigger bodied birds, and width is something that I probably pay the most attention to. But the underside of the bird, that's actually more important.
Well, you select for bag appeal and table appeal. You have a very discerning
yeah, and then I
that's
keep
looking for
growing
your-
those pullets, and
your
I keep
birds.
letting them grow until they get to laying. Then I start looking at, so they were meaty for the duration of growth, and now we're coming into egg season. So when did they start laying? How long did they lay? When did the egg size come up? Did they do anything funky when they were getting started laying? And I always have to go into laying season pullet heavy. Like if I've got, 50 to 80 pullets, I can have that by the time they're 6 months. And then at a year, I can have that again. And then I don't have very many left at 2, just by sorting through for the laying traits. So I don't lose that by chasing the table traits. And the different body structures, they can absolutely have different growth patterns too. And I like to see the girls start laying no earlier than 18 weeks. Before that, they're not going to pass forward good table traits because they're going to be too small. They develop too quickly and then got started too soon. And they don't breed that forward very well.
Those are typically the birds that's going to burn out on you and lose longevity. Those really fast matures, I don't breed from.
I will from the males, but I won't from the females.
Be careful about that because that can come back to bite you. Because the males
That's why I have more pen space.
So let me ask you this. On the male side, if we're looking on the commercial side, 12 pounds of feed to finish out a Cornish cross, 16 pounds for a Red Ranger. How much feed do you think it takes you to put a bird in a bag?
I've been curious
how many
about
weeks?
that too.
Well, what's your harvest? Are you a 16, 20 week?
I like between 16 and 18. After 18, when the tissues start tightening and the processing changes too, because not only does the texture for the table change, but so does your
Repair.
And how they respond to processing even, because before 18 weeks, I can twist a neck off. I don't need a knife. After that, when everything starts tightening, now I have to use the knife a lot more. And then it carries over into the cooking process too.
Sure. And the cockerels are starting to develop testosterone in their system. It's going to change the flavor of the meat a little bit as well.
A little gamier, but not much.
A little bit, but it's just things that you need to keep in mind.
Yeah.
My personal thought for dual purpose birds, Mandy's exactly right. That 16 to 18 weeks is the goal we ought to be aiming for processing our birds.
After that, the growth level's off, but they're eating the same. So you lose efficiency for your feed conversion.
Another thing to look for when you're breeding for production is you want good egg production. You're probably not going to get the great egg production you did in a bred to lay flock, but you want good egg production. You want good egg fertility and good hatchability, because those are every bit as important in meat flocks, or should be as important in meat flocks as laying flock.
What's going to be half of your hatch are the males. You're going to need, you're not going to keep them all. So they should be providing you with a source of income or sustenance.
I can't tell you how many scrawny, lean, terrible cockerels that fit 3 at a time into a crock pot, and they are 18, 19, 20 weeks old. I don't have birds like that anymore.
You're losing money by raising them that long.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. And they are going to be half to hatch. And if there's no market for them, why are you even hatching them?
So let's, make sure all of our non-breeding birds are worthy of putting in shrink wrap and selling.
We've talked about egg production, we've talked about meat production, and we've touched a little bit on dual purpose qualities in both of those categories. But ideally, dual purpose breeds are going to be somewhere between a really good egg layer and a really good meat production.
That's true. And I found that to breed for that, you have to come at it from a couple of different angles to avoid getting tunnel vision into one trait or another. And working out of at least 3 different pens so you can have your females collected for rate of lay. And because I do like to take like a more meat style male and breed him with the females that are the best rock star layers, because the offspring tend to come up more balanced by doing it that way. But I can't do it from a single pen. I have to have 3 different pens running that have been selected for what they're good at, and then crisscrossing through the line from there.
I want to touch on something that we can lose sight on sometimes, and that's learning how to identify good birds, great birds, and truly exceptional birds. And there's a big difference. I'm going to pause right here because our original recording for this episode was an hour and a half long. We'll bring you part 2 of this conversation next week as we continue our discussion on beginning your journey to real accomplishment with poultry. Till then, make sure you keep your flock happy, healthy, and productive. Thank you so much for listening to the Poultry Keepers Podcast.